I'm going to miss these sessions. It's just an amazing treat to read and talk with other people who love Faulkner about Faulkner.
Indeed.
So, but it's been a privilege. Thank you for inviting me to be part of it. And the tradition will continue, I'm sure. Okay, so this is what I put together. Parts of it I'm fairly sure about, but then others there's a big question mark, which is usually the way it happens with my work with Faulkner. But I wanted to begin by sharing part of Louise Cowan's comments about this novel, about the mansion, which she wanted to be a main emphasis of a book focused on Faulkner's turn toward the comic vision. We've talked about that some before. And she saw that as the conclusion of his writing career, and she also saw that comedy, the comic imagination, has not been given its due by the scholars and the critics. So she was always sending things to either me or to Baynard and me, and and we would talk about them. And this was leading up to the time of her passing. And she sent one that I don't have a date for, but she sent it to me. I promptly lost it, but she also sent it to Baynard, and then he kept it and sent it to me in 2022. And so I wanted to read a little bit of this to you, because this gives you an idea of what she thought about these last novels, especially The Mansion. She even put a title to this as either a book title or a version of a book title, or as a chapter within it, and it was The Upward Movement from Snopesism. Mary, you will remember some of this as well, because I know you and she talked about this a lot. So here's a part of what she sent us. Writers who can portray the fullness of the human situation are few indeed. We enshrine them in a list of great books and think of them as, in a way, missionaries for the ideas and values out of which a culture emerges. There's no accounting for a Shakespeare or a Homer. And to maintain that William Faulkner is one of their rank, a writer from a state that has long been considered the most backward region of the Union, is to utter a shocking, if not unbelievable, claim. It is the suggestion of this book, however, that hasn't been written yet, that William Faulkner of Oxford, Mississippi, is just such a prophetic voice. His work encompasses 19 novels and numerous short stories, which, when compared with his life and background, stun the imagination. His work, like Shakespeare's, defies the laws of probability. Such a man as William Faulkner, college dropout, pretender to military valor, regarded by many who knew him as, quote, count no count, could not possibly have written works of such erudition, such encompassing imagination, such idealistic purpose. Someone else must have passed them off under Faulkner's name. That we're able calmly to read such novels as Go Down Moses, Absalom, Absalom, and The Mansion, aware that they and 16 others were all written by the same man, a seemingly unlettered Southerner, should stagger the imagination of those who devote themselves to measuring the movements of taste. I'm still reading Louise. Mm-hmm. Faulkner himself describes the writer's task as the depiction of the old verities, and portrays the evolution of the human as impelled by nothing inherently noble, but by a primitive sense of justice so deeply ingrained that life itself is unimportant compared to the fulfillment of this imperative. His vision is always paradoxical. Something ignoble, revenge, becomes the goad impelling the great unwashed masses of humankind to become part of the human project, to emerge finally from the dust of the earth out of which they were created, joining the long human recording, quote from The Mansion, with, and this is to Helen and the bishops, the scornful and graceless seraphim. And here she drops in a parenthetical note in the note she sent us. We need to read Mary Mumbach's doctoral dissertation about The Mansion. So You live in her emails. What is required to save the human race from the state of entropy into which it has fallen after its lapse from the garden? Faulkner begins the Hamlet with a portrayal of the post-lapsarian human state after the fall, the reign of Will Varner in the community, and the arrival of Flem Snopes. Faulkner calls the downward impulsion toward the original state of nothingness before creation Snopesism, viewing it mythically as the influence of the fallen angels on a creature who, being free, is able to choose ill as well as good. The Snopes trilogy is thus Faulkner's statement about the evolution of civilization. As a dark and ironic comedy, it lacks the poetic beauty of the theme as it is treated in Go Down Moses. But what it lacks in lyric tenderness, it makes up for in the intellectual complexity of its darkly comic style. The struggle upward towards civilization is shown to be, then, a fall from the garden state. It has been motivated by nothing seemingly noble, but rather by a transformation of the primitive lex talionis, the inbuilt law of retaliation. This downward progress of the human to separate from the human community in a battle for its own rights is impelled and guided by the bitter scorn and malice of the fallen angels. I love the way she's using those last words of this novel in this way. But in its execution, the human motive of revenge is gradually altered by the hidden interiority of the almost obliterated image in which mankind was originally created. In the human community, there remain only traces of its former splendor. Eula Varner's impelling beauty, the inherent sense of justice and wisdom of the sewing machine salesman V.K. Ratliff, the chivalry of the gentleman Gavin Stevens, and the deeply embedded code of manners of the town. These forces join the inherent sense of justice represented by Stevens and the canny wisdom of the folk, as evidenced in the sewing machine salesman V.K. Ratliff. This ill-suited pair, a local Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, a Tom Sawyer and a Huckleberry Finn, choose for their hero not the idealism of a boy, but the unlikely love and grief of a young woman whose name, Linda Snopes, indicates in itself her predicament. The daughter figure, as so prominent in Western literature and now endangered by being incorporated into the Snopes household, is taught by a mentor the meaning of love and grief. This unlikely group of heroes, all motivated by a love of beauty and a sense of loss by the ravages of Snopesism, focuses finally on a member of the Snopes clan as the actual executor of their resistance. Mink Snopes, too low to be protected by the law of the tribe, becomes the executor of their deliverance from the growing spread of nothingness, taking over the entire human project. The horror of that dry rot, as Faulkner refers to it, is not to be found in the nothingness per se, but in the disguise of that vacuity, so that its emptiness seems to be substantial and real. And she goes on from there, but I'm going to cut it off right there. But you see, this is her general view of this novel. In my time, I want to talk more about Mink than about the others. Many are the descriptions that have attempted to capture the essence of Snopesism, including the one I just read from Dr. Cowan. And also there's one from Montgomery Ward Snopes. Less eloquent, but it's an insider summation of its aspirations. All right, he says, in admiration of the patriarch Flem, that's what we'll do. Every Snopes will make it his private and personal aim to have the whole world recognize him as the son of a bitch's son of a bitch. And I also like what Cleont Brooks had to say in the Yoknapatawpha country back in 1963. This is Brooks. The insidious horror of Snopesism is its lack of any kind of integrity, its pliability, its parasitic vitality, as of some low-grade thoroughly stubborn organism and its almost selfless ability to keep up pressure as if it were a kind of elemental force. The quality of honor, even a mean and rancorous honor, would immediately make it vulnerable, not merely by acting as a brake upon its purely predatory impulses, but by tempting it to fight back occasionally against odds that would ensure its defeat. It is because he lacks honor that Phlegm is really invulnerable. Like finance capitalism itself, Phlegm works inside the law. The law is actually on his side. It will therefore be only the madman, the outlaw, or the passionate man who can strike him down. That's Brooks. Well, Mink might fit all three of those categories, but he wouldn't fit Brooks' category of lacking the quality of honor. Certainly, Mink lacks honor in the way he retaliates against Zach Houston for what he considers a gesture of contempt. But by the time he confronts Phlegm at the end, he does act honorably, at least in his own eyes, as he fulfills the role old Master seems to have designated that he play in this long saga in which he finds himself. Mink, of course, is a key figure in the action of the novel, but he's not in it very much at all. He's absent from it more than he is present. I suppose we could say because most of his time, from the murder of Houston in 1908 to his release from Parchman Prison in 1946, is spent within the confines of the prison of Parchman, or he's outside planting, cultivating, and at harvest, picking cotton with the other prisoners. As he says to Montgomery Ward Snopes when he first hears from his cousin that Phlegm wants to help him escape, "I've been here a long time now, 15 years. I ain't had much to do for a right smart while now, but just work in the field and think. I wonder if he knows to risk that? A man wants to be fair, you know." What Mink means with his question, "I wonder if he knows to risk that," is whether Phlegm really wants to gamble that he has changed in prison and will no longer be out to get his revenge once he's released. We aren't given much of Mink's prison ruminations, what he might think about other than revenge against Phlegm. We can only guess from what we saw of him before the murder of Houston, how his mind might be working behind bars. But we do hear a considerable amount of his thought outside Parchman, after Parchman, enough for a fair assessment of his character. And I want to say, not his character as much as his soul, and enough to discern Faulkner's intentions in presenting him as different from the external and always dark judgments of other characters who know or just observe the, quote, damn little murdering maniac. You know, that is repeated so many times, some version of that throughout the novel. And that's Gavin, the gentleman Gavin, who says that, the damn little murdering maniac. The common judgment of Mink's obsession with revenge and his physical stature, this is Montgomery Ward, a damn little worn out, dried up shrimp of a man, not as big as a 14-year-old boy. That common judgment is accurate enough. But he is also fleshed out in the novel in an entirely different way when he does appear that qualifies and softens the image that others and the law have of him as simply a low-down, vengeful killer. That's not who Mink really is, for some context. In a 2010 essay titled Linda Snopes Cole, Faulkner's Radical Woman, Keith Louise Fulton suggests that during her activist phase, Linda's teaching Negro children in a Negro church, quote, the Mesopotamian folklore and Nordic fairy tales, that is to say, not the poetry of Donne that Gavin gives her, her teaching those things which the Christian religion has arrogated into its seasonal observances, indicates that, quote, Linda has the complexity of mythological thought and yet represents a twist to our comprehension of mythology. The mythologies we are familiar with tell of the extraordinary and the heroic, the underworlds and the upper worlds. Linda's, however, and this is still Fulton. Linda's, however, is the world of the mundane, which mythos and the codifiers of myth have devalued. We hear little to nothing about what might be considered heroic exploits of Linda during her brief marriage to Barton Cole and their time fighting in the Spanish Civil War. But we do hear a considerable amount about her work later. It's very unglamorous. Rosie the Riveter, she becomes one of those, and during World War II, and then her well-intentioned, misguided attempts to educate the black children of Jefferson after she returns. But though in her stealthy, distant way, Linda enacts what Fulton calls, quote, Faulkner's reversal of Aeschylus, that is to say the daughter or stepdaughter, in this instance, unlike Athena, opposing the father or stepfather. Linda seems not to possess the stuff of myth that her mother Eula did, which Chick Mallison at one point describes as, quote, that aura, nimbus, condition, whatever the word is, in which Mrs. Snopes not just existed, lived, breathed in, but created about herself by just existing, living, breathing. Whereas, Chick says, he does go on, Linda didn't have that quality. That one was not transferable. So all that remained for her and Gavin was continence. So he's imagining they're going to have an affair. To put it crudely, morality. Because where could they go except his automobile? With her non-voluptuous body, as Chick speaks of it, and her duck voice, however, Faulkner presents in Linda's canny scheming and smooth hiding of it from Gavin and VK compelling evidence of heroic action of a lesser sort and on a lower level of myth than that which the old Olympians spawned, especially notable in Linda's new, previously ordered British Jaguar, and her final look into Gavin's eyes as she says again, as she turns to go, and as she said in the past, she loves him. And then this from the novel, her dark blue eyes, that whether they were gentle or not, or tender or not, or really candid or not, it didn't matter. No faint smile, no nothing, just the eyes, which even at this distance were not quite black. And then she was gone. Hope we get to talk about that some when a little bit later. Faulkner seems to me to do something similar, but appropriately different, with the lowly mink in redirecting, even recasting traditional mythic expectations onto a lesser ignominious figure, who nonetheless turns out to be the decisive factor, as Dr. Louise wrote, the agent, the final cause, so to speak, in not only redressing an injustice done to him personally, but in the process delivering a community from the grip of legal avarice that is altering their way of life, whether they are conscious of it or not. Though Mink and Linda are never present in the novel together until the moment after Mink shoots Flem and Linda helps him escape, they are nonetheless in confederation against a common enemy, united against a common kind of wrong done to them by the same man. Flem has acted to increase or protect his wealth in both cases. All his life he has belonged, quote, simply to money, as Gavin thinks back on the funeral. This is when he's thinking what was said, because the funeral was a big funeral. Everybody came. It seems not inappropriate to portray Mink similarly as a figure of what might be called lower myth. At any rate, I want to pursue it a bit by suggesting that Faulkner's narration, through his mastery of the method of the concealed narrator, elevates Mink beyond the common estimation of him as no more than an illiterate, darn little rattlesnake or viper, one of those many descriptions of him. By disclosing a few of those prison thoughts, mixed in with what are no doubt his solitary meditations on what he comes more and more to be convinced he must do to Flem when he is released, he becomes a model convict and diligent worker in the fields on a crop not his own. And as he says to the warden upon getting the letter from his wife, Yeti, after being in prison 3 years, he's confident that he'll be released early and soon, as long as he obeys the rules he first heard from his lawyer and has memorized. By doing what they tell me to, not talking back and not fighting, not to try to escape, mainly that, not to try to escape. And then the warden asks, should I write her then that you're coming home? And he says, not right away. He's been in prison 3 years. Not right away. There's something I got to attend to first, something private. When I finish that, then I'll come on home. Write her that. And all the while he's thinking, yes, sir. It looks like I done had to come all the way to Parchman just to turn right around and go back home and kill Flem. So that's been in his mind from the beginning. But our understanding of Mink begins with some understanding of his social status. I want to dwell just a little bit on that because I think it is important in the novel. In most of his novels and many of his short stories, Faulkner draws heavily on his lifelong familiarity with the social structures of the South, both antebellum and postbellum. The mansion is set in the postbellum era, beginning in the late 19th century, by which time it had become clear after the war and Reconstruction that there would be no going back to an Old South, so-called, in which planters and farmers constituted the dominant social strata, both of whom had had the opportunity to own slaves, but among whom ownership of slaves was far more prevalent in the planters than the farmers. Naturally, of course, that would stand to reason. In his book, Plain Folk of the Old South, Southern historian Frank Owsley describes the before and after impact of the war and Reconstruction on those two social classes, planters and farmers, in the South. Operations of both classes were disrupted. Widespread ownership of plantations and farms alike was lost, and 4 million freed slaves suddenly entered the culture and the economy. A major consequence of the drastic upheaval of the war was the emergence of a new class in the South, the poor white, who became a virtual substitute or replacement for the antebellum farmer, who wasn't wealthy by plantation standards, but was self-sufficient and generally comfortable in the existence he and his family established through hard manual and mostly agricultural labor. The farmer in the Old South knew how to do things necessary for subsistence and also for some measure of profit and comfort, unlike the planter who had slaves to perform all the domestic and agricultural labor. After the Civil War, the farmer and his family, of course, retained and still practiced their farming and domestic skills, though in vastly altered circumstances, with those 4 million slaves entering the workforce, many of them anyway. Whereas the ex-planter was often forced to fragment and sell off much of his property in bits and pieces. And we can think of the way the Compsons in The Sound and the Fury sold all part of their property to send Quentin to Harvard. In any case, the planters had to depend on hired labor, comprised of members of the essentially new class in the South that came to be known as the poor white, and there were two of them, tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Those are the two subdivisions that are in that we see in the mansion. And differences between the two classes shed light on Mink's circumstance in the mansion. And this is around the turn of the century. We can note the prosperous but by no means wealthy farmers like Houston. And on a lesser scale, many of the clientele of Ratliff's primary business, which is selling sewing machines, those small farmers, such as the Quicks, the Tolls, the Armisteds, and the Bookrights of Frenchman's Bend, and the environs of the town of Jefferson. They're not as prosperous as Houston, but they are landowners. They own small bits of land, and they're self-sufficient. But before that, both tenant farmers and sharecroppers were landless. But tenant farmers, the reason I'm emphasizing this is that if you'll notice in the novel, when Faulkner's talking about those people, He always says tenant farmers and sharecroppers. He makes a point of distinguishing between the two. Both of them were landless, but tenant farmers had greater autonomy and financial latitude. They rented the land they farmed, had small amounts of money, paid rent, either in cash or a portion of their crop, owned their own tools, seeds for planting, and animals, and usually could themselves choose what crops to plant. Sharecroppers, by contrast, were much worse off. They typically did not own many, if any, of their own tools. They would prize something like a hatchet or an axe, if they could come by it. They had no store of seeds of their own and usually possessed only the mule or horse that pulled their wagon from one sharecropping site to another, perhaps a lean cow for milk and a hog or two. The sharecropper was dependent on the landowner for ordinary living expenses and supplies, furnished, I've got that in quote marks in my talk, furnished to the sharecropper with the amount of the furnish bill. We read that in Faulkner, right? What the furnish bill is, deducted from the cash yield of his crop at harvest, along with an agreed upon portion which could amount to as much as half of the total. Further, the sharecropper had little say in the management of his farming. The landowner directing him what to plant and how to cultivate the crop as it grew toward harvest. The now discredited book, I'll Take My Stand, by 12 Southerners, has a couple of essays, one by Andrew Lytle called The Hind Tit, and the other by Robert Penn Warren called The Briar Patch, that describes what life became like for the so-called farming South. As Lytle puts it, the farming South has had few to tell of its virtues, as a large part of its yeomanry, a sturdy stock, came to be regarded as poor white trash. Or we might recall the narrative of James Agee and the famous photos of Walker Evans in their book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which was published in 1941. And also Will Campbell has an essay on the southern roots of the two terms redneck and white trash that is good. Clearly, to get back to the novel, Mink is among the poorest of the poor white sharecroppers, not a tenant farmer. He is dependent on Will Varner for his and his family's subsistence, though proudly considering himself, quote, not a rich man like Houston, but only an independent one, asking no favors of any man, paying his own way. Mink's thoughts about a thriving farmer and the single cow he, Mink, owns, virtually his only asset outside his mule and wagon. And this is what he's thinking. She, the cow, had missed some way, failed to freshen, and there he was, not only having gone a winter without milk, and now faced with another whole year without it, he had also missed out on the calf, for which he had had to pay a 50-cent cash bull fee, since the only bull in reach he could get for less than $1 was the scrub bull belonging to a Negro who insisted on cash at the gate. With careful and intricate narration, Faulkner goes to great lengths in the first few pages of The Mansion to give us images of the severe circumstances of the sharecropper through his depiction of Mink. As a result, we most likely understand, maybe even sympathize with, I didn't say condone, but at least sympathize with, Mink's deception when he finds his emaciated and still barren cow loose in Houston's pasture with his beef herd, past the calendar date agreed upon by all the landowners, tenant farmers, and sharecroppers, after which all stock would be kept up until all crops were out of the field. So the discovery of this cow's whereabouts is like an epiphany for Mink, and he goes off to think about it. If he leaves his cow with Houston's herd through the winter, it will certainly fatten and most likely be carrying a calf. But he has to come up with a lie as to why he hasn't retrieved the cow earlier. But the consequences of that lie become complicated and lead to Will Varner's and Frenchman's Bend Constable Lon Quick adjudicating that Mink owes Zach Houston $18.75 for wintering Mink's cow, which Mink discharges by digging post holes and stringing fence for Houston at 50 cents a day for 37 and a half days. Plus, of course, the fatal extra dollar that Mink cites as the reason for his ambush and murder of Houston. I ain't shooting you for them 37 and a half 4-bit days. I killed you because of that extra $1 a pound fee. So Mink's murder from ambush of an arrogant man. And arrogance is certainly no killing offense. But Mink's murder from ambush begins the long odyssey that will end only at the novel's conclusion. Houston himself as an agent of injustice will diminish in Mink's consciousness and soon disappear completely. He doesn't think about him anymore, to be replaced by what he believes to be the true cause of his travails, of course, his cousin Flem. His every waking moment in prison is spent as a test of his patience in waiting for release and the chance to confront Flem. He doubts Montgomery Ward Snopes' accounts of Flem's supposed motive for trying to help him escape, that he, Flem, has changed his thinking about Mink, according to Montgomery Ward's telling of it, and expects Mink's thinking about him, Flem, to change once he gets out. But the ridiculous, almost comic escape attempt seals it for Mink, who is clear-eyed and stoic about the whole episode, as he says when the warden asks him, "Didn't you know you couldn't get away with it?" "They told me. I was warned." He stood, not moving, relaxed, small and frail, his face downbent a little, musing, peaceful, almost like faint smiling. "He hadn't ought to fool me to get caught in that dress and sunbonnet," he said. It's laughable just hearing him describe it. I wouldn't have done that to him. And as he says to Montgomery Ward, he hadn't ought to use that dress, but it don't matter. If I had made it out then, maybe I would have changed. But I reckon I won't now. I reckon I'll just wait, which he does for another 23 years. Mink goes to Parchman Prison with a life sentence, arriving there at cotton picking time, the prime harvest time for the principal crop for tenant farmers and sharecroppers in Mississippi's central and southern Delta region. None of that land is privately owned anymore, not a bit of it, not an acre. When Mink sees the cotton fields outside Parchman, he thinks of the competition in cotton picking among several southern states, in which, as he reflects, quote, every cotton county in Mississippi would be grooming their fastest champions to pick against the best of Arkansas and Missouri for the championship picker of the Mississippi Valley. Yeah, there really were cotton picking competitions. And that has survived in many southern places as cotton picking festivals. You know, you just need to remember the origin of the epithet cotton picking. It was demeaning, grueling work for slaves. Right? So to say that somebody's cotton picking this or cotton picking that, you know, you better think about who you're saying it to. But Mink thinks as he enters the prison, that champion wouldn't be here, that is in Parchman. Quote, no champion of anything would ever be here because only failures wound up here. The failures at killing and stealing and lying. He remembered how at first he had cursed himself for letting them catch him, but he knew better now. You were either born a champion or not a champion. And that if he had been born a champion, Houston not only couldn't, he wouldn't have dared misuse him about that cow to where he had to kill him. That some folks were born to be failures and get caught always. Some folks were born to be lied to and believe it. And he was one of them. And this is when he goes into prison. That's going to change by the time he gets out. But here, seeing the fields literally white under harvest around Parchman prompts Mink to recall other such good crops in his past. They've been quite rare, but they have happened. And this is Mink thinking, quote, as though back there in the spring, the ground itself had said, all right, for once, let's confederate instead of fighting. The ground, the dirt, which any and every tenant farmer and sharecropper knew to be his sworn foe and mortal enemy. The hard, implacable land, which wore out his youth and his tools, and then his body itself. And not just his body, but that soft, mysterious one he had touched that first time with amazement and reverence and incredulous excitement the night of his marriage. Now worn too, to leather toughness that half the time, it seemed to him most of the time, he would be too spent with physical exhaustion to remember it was even female. Until was it any wonder that a man would look at that inimical, irreconcilable square of dirt to which he was bound and chained for the rest of his life and say to it. All this, as you remember, is in the novel, is the italicized part. You know, this is his address to the land. I think it's worth reading. You got me. You'll wear me out because you're stronger than me, since I'm just bone and flesh. I can't leave you because I can't afford to, and you know it. Me and what used to be the passion and excitement of my youth, until you wore out the youth and I forgot the passion, will be here next year with the children of our passion for you to wear that much nearer the grave. And you know it. And the year after that, and the year after that, and you know that too. And not just me, but all my tenant and cropper kind that have immolated youth and hope on 40 or 50 or 30 or 40 or 50 acres of dirt that wouldn't nobody but our kind work, because you're all our kind have. But we can burn you. Every late February or March, we can set fire to the surface of you until all of you in sight is scorched and black. And there ain't one goddamn thing you can do about it. You can wear out our bodies and dull our dreams and wreck our stomachs with the sow belly and cornmeal and molasses, which is all you afford us to eat. But every spring we can set you afire again, and you know that too. There were practical reasons why they burned the fields, right? You'll probably know about those, but they're in a 2010 lecture on Faulkner's The Bear for the Teachers Academy of the Dallas Institute, Louise Cowan said of Faulkner that he, quote, exaggerates with figurative language his descriptions of the wilderness, which exists in contrast in that novel to the land. As the hunters wait for the game to appear, the wilderness is described as waiting with them. It is, quote, sentient, not quite inimical, attentive, breathing, leaning in, witness to the drama of the hunt taking place within it. In the passage from the mansion I just read, eloquently articulated for Mink, there's nothing exalted like this, nor anything faintly bucolic. A contrast with, say, Tolstoy's image in Anna Karenina of the peasants in the field that has a strong impact on their overseer Levin, who, quote, envied them their healthy gaiety and felt a wish to take part in that expression of the joy of living. In fact, good health and the joy of living are just what are missing in the sharecropper's life. And yet Faulkner's memorial, as I think of it, in Mink's words, has its own store of narrative power. Cleont Brooks titles his chapter on the mansion Faulkner's Revenger's Tragedy, likening it to the Elizabethan tradition, except that he doesn't quite mean that. The mansion is not tragedy at all, but what Louise Cowan would call an infernal comedy, which, Baynard, you spoke of in your lecture, a literary genre in which, as she describes it, quote, deception and disguise are used for the purpose of gaining advantage to the harm of others. Even the guardians of a community realize their helplessness to change the general situation and either withdraw or concentrate their efforts on the rescue of the feminine victim, as they do in the mansion, that is Gavin Stevens and V.K. Ratliff. The wicked are in control of the city, though in the end, I'm still reading Louise, though in the end they are outwitted by someone even trickier than they. The biter is bit, the gull gulled. These eventualities are often the outcome of infernal comedy, since wickedness multiplies incrementally and gives the appearance of infinite resource. Yet there is usually a reckoning in which the community is reaffirmed. Justice is meted out to offenders, and the innocent are vindicated. And of course, in this novel, the reckoning is the work of Mink. Mink finally does get out of prison in 1946, and he's 63 years old after 38 years of his original sentence, life. 15 years, then the botched escape attempt, because of which he loses his model prisoner status and faces an additional 20 years before he's eligible for parole again. But when Mink is released, 2 years before his second sentence ends, thanks to the petition instigated by Linda and made actually possible by Gavin's expertise as a lawyer and his connection with prominent people, some of whom actually signed the petition. And Gavin overcomes his misgivings about Mink's release by coming up with a bribe offer to Mink, made possible by Linda's money, to keep him away from Flem, whom Gavin believes correctly that he will come back home to kill. And why does Gavin agree to help Linda? There's a practical reason, and it is believed that if he doesn't help Linda, this is what he says to VK, that she'll find another lawyer who will, and who might try to make a handsome profit from it too. But also, Gavin says to VK, he does it because he not only believes in and admires fate and destiny, but wants, quote, to be one of the instruments too, no matter how modest. More immediately, though, he is the unknowing instrument of Linda, who smoothly hides her true intention underneath what appears to Gavin an ill-advised gesture of kindness to a distant and unknown kinsman. Mink refuses the money and leaves prison with $13.85 and embarks upon the journey that will culminate in both his cousin Flem's death and, I believe, his own. And I hope we can discuss this because some people, there's a disagreement about that. Faulkner presents Mink's experience once outside prison as an odyssey. I'm using that word in the epic sense, as an odyssey, a journey not aimless but deliberate, certain of purpose but uncertain of what he will encounter on his way to accomplishing that purpose. His conviction that he must kill Flem has by the time of his release become to him unassailable. He cannot not get his revenge. He comes to regard it as his role in a saga in which he is the agent of justice. It is easy to conclude that this is an illusion that Mink tells himself in order to justify a self-serving motive. Yet Faulkner presents it as more than that and as different than that. Mink has a refined and essentially impersonal sense of justice as it ought to operate in a world where there has to be some certitude, some cardinal points of ontological assurance that the world is not random, not merely absurd, and especially for people like him, whose circumstances are relentless and grueling. Mink claims very little for himself, almost nothing, but believes in a kind of bedrock foundation upon which creation itself must rest, else all would be without form and void, as in the time. He doesn't think he's a contentious man. Quote, it was simply that his own bad luck had all his life continually harassed and harried him into the constant and unflagging necessity of defending his own simple rights. Without seeing himself as such, he's an everyman of his social caste, the sharecropper. He represents an axe for all those like him who come into a world stacked against them, where one ought at least to be able to count on family. He moves toward his encounter with Flem with faith that, quote, old master just punishes, he don't play jokes. One of which would be that, old master brings him all this way into Flem for his ancient rusty pistol not to fire. He says it's got to fire. He is the instrument of that punishment. In his knight-errant purity, Gavin may believe himself to be a modest instrument of fate and destiny, but Mink assumes the role boldly with a full belief in his having earned it of old master himself. There are plenty of humorous elements in Mink's Odyssey, enough to make it seem a mock epic in terms of the challenges he faces along the way. Small, even trivial by epic standards, but to him gargantuan, all but overwhelming. For instance, his buying of food. And I think about this when I'm driving to a new place in Dallas, that I don't know how to get to. I feel lost, and will I ever make it? For instance, his buying of food that seems to get more expensive as it sits on the counter in front of him. And as I've said, as I've said, certainly there's little about him that bespeaks an heroic stature. You can't make him look heroic. We're shown often that he is small, bedraggled, dirty, with hands like the paws of a pet coon, uninterested in anything in his path, any obstacle not affecting him directly. As Dr. Cowan said, he lacks any outward nobility and has become like a fury of old. Vengeance is his sole motive for continuing what might seem to have been but is no longer an insignificant life. And Mary, you were saying that Dr. Gregory actually has said that he becomes a blessings giver at Eumenides, I think, that she's written. So maybe we can talk about that in just a few minutes. I'm not far from being done. Mink knew 35 years ago when he told the warden to write his wife, Yeti, that he had something to do before coming home, that he would have to go to Memphis to buy a gun. That was way back in chapter 5, and it is not until chapter 12 that Mink enters the story again. At the end of chapter 5, he is leaving Parchment in the fall and begins to remember things he had forgotten in those 38 years as a prisoner, one of which is the beauty of his home country in Frenchman's Bend around this time of year, in the fall, late September, when, quote, all the land would be gold and crimson, with hickory and gum and oak and maple, and the old fields warm with sage and splattered with scarlet sumac. In 38 years, he had forgotten that, when suddenly, somewhere deep in his memory, there was a tree, a single tree. The memory takes him back to a time in childhood when, though small, he managed to kill a squirrel with his father's huge shotgun, bigger than he is, which his stepmother's asked for because his father has beat her so severely that she can't bear to eat the fatback, coarse meal, and molasses that they customarily have. We talked about this a little bit before. So he goes to the tree, now in his memory, and manages to shoot the squirrel. He's terribly afraid that he's not going to be able to do it. And then takes it back to his stepmother, and she says, we'll relish it together right now. The tree is no doubt gone by now, Mink thinks, but, quote, he knew better. Unaxed in memory and unaxable, inviolable and immune, golden and splendid with October. Why, yes, he thought, it ain't a place a man wants to go back to. The place don't even need to be there no more. What aches a man to go back to is what he remembers. This tender reflection may not cancel out Mink's meanness, but Faulkner gives his reader a position from which to see that Mink is not just a throwaway, to use Toni Morrison's word in Beloved, but fully human, possessing many, if not all, of the traits that Faulkner was fond of listing, as in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. He also lists them in Go Down Moses. And here's the list in this Nobel Prize speech: love and honor and pity, and pride and compassion and sacrifice. And Mink's reflection here on the single tree are not unlike Isaac McCaslin's thoughts about the vanishing wilderness in Go Down Moses, or even Setha's about rememory in Beloved. Once in a note about the mansion, Dr. Cowan included as a chapter title for the book she intended to write, quote, Mink's Transformation, the Goody Hay Experience, which she never got around to explaining, and it's always kind of puzzled me, though I've tried to think about it. Though the Goody Hay experience in chapter 12 is the most memorable of the encounters of his Odyssey, more integral to the action than the episodic elements that partake of Faulkner's fondness for the tall tale of Southern folkways, such as the stories of old Meadowfield and Res Snopes and Clarence Egglestone Snopes. It isn't fully clear to me how Mink's brief time with Goody Hay who helps Mink after he is robbed of the $10 he needs to buy the murder weapon. How these 3 days, Thursday through Sunday, impact him in the transformational way that Dr. Kalman suggests. Hope we can discuss this too. The self-ordained Reverend Goody Hay is not only a preacher, but he's a planter, a builder of churches. His vocation is the same as St. Paul's, and his conversion experience is very much like St. Paul's dramatic encounter with Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus after being a notorious persecutor of Christians. Paul, whose name then was Saul, is struck blind for 3 days, after which he enters on his lifelong work of building the first churches outside Jerusalem, in which Jesus is worshipped as the Christ. Reverend Goody Hay's experience is dramatic too, and just as decisive. It saves Goody Hay's life for service to Christ, who comes to him, love this, who comes to him underwater and smoking a cigarette. Two great ironies. When Goody Hay first sees Mink, he says, "Hell, you're a preacher." Why does he say that? Perhaps because Mink has the same, quote, coldly seething desert hermit's eyes that Goody Hay himself has. He recognizes Mink as a man with a mission like himself. Goody Hay is having trouble planning his church because it's not exactly orthodox. He is looked upon by his prospective neighbors as Paul and the early Christians were looked upon by the Pharisees. The settled, reputable people in that part of the country, not to mention the banks who hold mortgages on the property on which he wants to build, don't want Goody Hay and his ragtag followers, both black and white, and that's another problem at that time in that area, all of whom have some connection to the military and the recently ended war. There's that lovely image of the black and white women, the two women, the black woman consoling the white one for her loss. So the center of Goody Hay's message is his vision of Christ coming to him as he is drowning underneath in the Pacific Ocean underneath the. He doesn't think he can tell it well enough, but is encouraged by his small congregation of wartime survivors during every service. He's trying to do a homily there, and they keep saying, "Tell it, tell it again." He doesn't think he can tell it well enough, but is encouraged by his small congregation. His by now ritualized prayer is an indication of why the locals don't want him. "Save us, Christ, poor sons of bitches," which is profane and sacred at the same time and theologically sound. So Goody Hay has to move from place to place, start over, try again. On the Sunday when Mink expects to get paid the $10 Dad has stolen from him, this one of the characters who are supposedly helping Goody Hay, the congregation is meeting in a Negro schoolhouse, same meeting place that Linda has with her students. Does Goody Hay's fierce, mission-driven determination present to Mink a living model that reflects and valorizes in his own eyes his determination to kill Flem? Goody Hay's story that he is prompted to tell again and again becomes formalized and eloquent, like scripture, like myth, to his congregation. And I think of Mahalia Jackson standing behind MLK at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. And he had this prepared, formal thing, and she said, tell them about the dream, Martin. And then he tells about the dream. A little bit what's going on here. Does hearing the myth lead Mink in some way to formalize his own story, and as it were, allow him to put on the armor of his own mission with a heightened, exalted sense of its inviolable importance? Goody Hay doesn't change the steadfastness of Mink's motive, but as he's told by another laborer in Goody Hay's vineyard, "You're working for the Lord now, Buster." And does it also include his being, for those 3 days, again, part of Goody Hay's community of sufferers whom he just watches them, and who collectively help him on his way home to a murder that they don't know about. And remember, he sees that pistol. He says, I can just take this pistol and leave. But he doesn't. He says, I've never been a thief. And so he doesn't. So I'm thinking that there may be something in Goody Hayes' God-drivenness that articulates for Mink his own high-mindedness in his quest for justice, which Mink comes to sense in creation itself, that not only allows but demands that quest. In the beginning of the novel, Mink disavows belief in a personal God, again referring to old Master, whom he replaces in his thoughts with the pronouns they, them, it. Doesn't mean Mink is woke, does it?
No.
The them, but then he quotes scripture, or he paraphrases scripture. The them of whom it was promised that not even a sparrow should fall unmarked. That's back on page 5. Mink says he's not a religious man. At least he disavows belief in a specific version of God. But during his 38 years in Parchment, comes eventually to believe in old Master, and an old Master's assertion of justice, which Mink, as I mentioned, calls fairness, as the ideal according to which people, especially fellow members of a clan, ought to live among each other, ought to live with among each other. So if Mink exalts the lowly sharecropper murderer Mink, he does so in the manner of what I believe is Mink's death. Again, I want us to discuss that at the end. Throughout his quest, he has been wary of the ground, the earth, which, as he imagines it from birth, attempts almost lovingly to assert its claim over humankind as dust of the earth, from which we come and to which we must return. Mink won't lie down without something underneath to shield him from the earth, which Brooks suggests comes from the countryman's fear of illness that will prevent harvesting his crop. But as Faulkner presents it, his wariness is also cast as mythic. On the final page of the novel, the narrative voice modulates to blend Mink's chthonic sense of the earth with a more than earthly, more than mortal perspective, inviting us to see beneath and beyond Mink's death to its spiritual dimension. And Faulkner's narrative method at the end allows us to see that Mink partially, but only partially, shares that more than mortal perspective. We get the whole thing. Mink gets part of it, I think. So let me see if I can make sense of this. Now released from the obligation of his mission, that is to kill Flem, Mink is also released from his fear of both earth and death. And he lies down, at which moment he, quote, could feel the mink snopes. This is on the very last page of the novel. He could feel the mink snopes that had to spend so much of his life just having unnecessary bother and trouble, beginning to creep, seep, flow easy as sleeping. He could almost watch it, following all the little grass blades and tiny roots, the little holes the worms made, down and down into the ground, already full of the folks that had the troubles, but were free now. Here Mink imagines the community he is about to join, not the Snopeses, but the true clan of fellow sufferers, the wretched of the earth, who have a common destiny with the noblest and are therefore, and this going back, quoting again from the novel, Mink's consciousness, himself among them, equal to any, good as any, brave as any, being inextricable from, anonymous with all of them, the beautiful, the splendid, the proud and the brave, right on up to the very top itself, among the shining phantoms and dreams which are the milestones of the long human recording. Helen and the bishops, the kings and the unhomed angels, the scornful and graceless seraphim, which again Louise refers to in that part that I read at the beginning. So with the last words of this last paragraph, beginning with the words, right on up to the very top itself, I'm not sure I'm right about this, but I'm going to see what you think. Right on up to the very top itself, the language then at that point seamlessly breaks away from Mink's consciousness to an omniscient perspective, beginning with the shining phantoms and dreams, which are the milestones of the long human recordings. This is not Mink, right, anymore. Mm-hmm. This is omniscient. Mm-hmm. Helen and the bishops, the king and the unhomed angels, the scornful and graceless seraphim. That's the perspective from that very top that Mink imagines, from which all earthly things are cast subspecies aeternitatis. The novels, it is the novel's memorial epitaph for Mink, who finally becomes one of the countless but treasured least of these, of whom it was promised by them, again his pronoun, that not even a sparrow should fall unmarked. And this is Faulkner's, it seems to me, Faulkner's comic version of the Christian belief. Among even the pagan and profane, the last shall be first. Thanks.